Hey, you can get some cool and fun rewards for helping me help kids. Stick around after the video for more information.
You're a Wonder Woman in your satin tights. Condor Man.
Hey, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to Essential Issues, where I talk about my favorite DC comics of the past that are still affordably available today, blabbing about why they are special to me and what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of real life. Now, warning, this series does freely contain spoilers, but I think even spoiled, the stories I feature are still well worth reading. For more info about the intent of this series and what to expect from it, check out the video on the Christian Geek Central YouTube channel titled Essential Issues Series Introduction. Okay, well, we've covered some key origin stories and events from DC Comics, and now, by seeming coincidence, as we head into the spooky month of October, we're finally dipping into the dark, supernatural side of the DC Universe to look at the Spectre, specifically the first 4 issues of the series by writer-artist team John Ostrander and Tom Mandrake, who breathed new life into the character with a series that both respected the Spectre's past and reintroduced his origins and current relevance to modern readers. Crimes and Punishments is only a 4-issue collection, but it's a crash course in who the Spectre is and what makes him completely stand apart from every other DC Comics character. Coming back to the book, I'm reminded almost immediately of the 2 things that originally pulled me in right away. The first is the art style. The use of ink is liberal, almost making black seem like the default color of some panels. Deep shadows create a mood and visual contrast that still holds up as striking to me. The second element I notice again is philosophical. In the early to mid-90s, when this was originally written, there was growing support in popular thinking that, quote-unquote, people are all basically good. A vague statement that is either easily demonstrably false or so non-committal in what it's actually affirming as to make it empty of any meaning. It was largely a sentimental expression that seemed meant to be unexamined so that we could all just feel better about ourselves morally than we actually should. But Jim Corrigan has been fighting the evil in humanity for decades as the Spectre, and has this to say among his very first words in this story. "I'm tired. Confront evil, that's what they told me. For 50 years, that's what I've done, and the world is no better. The world has only become more perverse in its choice of evils, and I don't even know why." Although not part of DC's adult-oriented Vertigo imprint, this series had the Spectre regularly confronting real and disturbing human evils, in addition to the more standard comic book variety. And as the series advances, Jim Corrigan also has to face some of the evils in himself. Something else fresh the series did was finally make sense of the Spectre's power levels and make them work in an ongoing series. The Spectre has always been the most powerful protagonist in the DC universe, which is part of what makes him so cool, but it's hard to create story tension when your hero is seemingly omnipotent. And you also don't want to read about a depowered Spectre because his power level is a big part of what makes him unique and interesting. So John Ostrander came up with the idea that the Spectre is basically omnipotent in his own spiritual dimension. He's generally powerful, but he's truly at his greatest power levels in his own spiritual dimension, which he can draw people into first by enveloping them, usually with his iconic green cloak in some way. Once someone is in the Spectre's cloak, the Spectre can do whatever he wants to them, which usually involves crazy, reality-bending poetic justice, or more accurately, poetic wrath. In the first example, the Spectre pulls a car full of freshly guilty hit-and-run gang members into his cloak, condemning them for bringing death into the neighborhood through violence and drugs. He then turns them into his own fingers, each of the 4 criminals growing out of the tips of one of the Spectre's green-gloved digits. He then proceeds to inject a syringe full of angry flames into his own forearm, causing his hand to erupt in a raging fire that cooks off flesh down to the bone, the gangbangers along with it. They scream in agony amidst the flames, and the next panel cuts to them burning under the wreck of their own car, pinned down and dying a horrible death. And yet the Spectre seems to mourn something of what has just happened. He has a haunting complexity about him. And Jim Corrigan is haunted. There are things about his past, his origins as the Spectre, that he wants to better understand in this story. He seeks out one of the few men still alive that played a role in that origin story, a criminal named Louis Snipe, now a dying old man, and not exactly cooperative in giving Corrigan the information he wants. The Spectre is powerful, but if he wants to read minds, he has to enter the soul, appropriately by passing through the eyes of his target. Once inside someone's soul, the Spectre is on their turf, and depending how strong their soul is, and it's unclear in the series what makes someone have a strong soul versus a weak soul, but depending on how strong their soul is, even a normal person could be as powerful or more powerful than the Spectre on that playing field. As the Spectre does in his cloak, his intended target has the ability to manipulate the world of their own soul, which can put the Spectre at serious risk. And yet the Spectre still often has an advantage, being an unusually powerful spiritual being to begin with. And so while he usually comes out on top in these encounters, they are a great conceptual device that turn information gathering into reality-bending combat sequences that allow artist Tom Mandrake to cut loose with some memorable and often creepy visuals. A number of issues in the series involve the Spectre fulfilling his role as an agent of wrath on behalf of the unavenged dead. He is uniquely tuned to unjust deaths, murders in particular, and is driven to find answers regarding who is in need of his punishing wrath, who is deserving. But despite his supposed status as a servant of God, or as it is often vaguely described, the voice instead of God, the Spectre is not infallible in his delivery of wrath, which can cause harm to the innocent as collateral damage, or arguable overkill, even when it is dealing with cases of the guilty. Why this occurs is explored more over the course of the series, as the symbiotic relationship between the Spectre and host Jim Corrigan is revealed in more detail. As I mentioned earlier, the story also serves to retell the Spectre's origins. Jim Corrigan, the human ghost who acts as host to the Spectre entity, searches for his own answers regarding some specific details of his murder 50 years ago, while Detective Nate Kane has discovered what remains of Corrigan's body. The detective's friend, a social worker named Amy Biderman, happened to briefly meet Corrigan at a hospital, and instantly she becomes intrigued by him. After meeting with Nate at the police station, on her way out, she comes across a CSI mold of Corrigan's body, made from the recovered barrel of cement he was killed and buried in. She realizes that her man of mystery is frighteningly more mysterious than she had imagined. Amy soon encounters Corrigan again, and really this opening story goes back and forth between her quest to discover answers about Corrigan and Corrigan on a quest to discover more answers about his own origins as a Spectre, and then they bring these characters together, and even after this story, and of course continuing on to the end of this current story, Amy is a very important character. Corrigan decides to open up to her about who and what he is, in part because she had offered to be a listening ear to him earlier as a social worker. You know, she is qualified for that sort of thing. And so Amy serves as the audience, in a sense, a character who is discovering who Jim Corrigan and the Spectre are for the first time. Through a series of Christmas Carol-style flashbacks, the Spectre lets Amy witness key moments in Jim Corrigan's life, from being raised by an abusive fire and brimstone preacher to becoming a hard-boiled, excessively violent cop, to his death at the hands of gang leader Gat Benson. But the most pivotal moment comes just after his death, when Corrigan realizes his murderer will go unpunished and will also likely kill the fiancée he left behind. A disembodied voice asks Corrigan amidst his rage, "Will you not trust God's justice unless you see it done?" In a boiling anger, Corrigan's reply encapsulates the heart of his character and what drives him throughout the entire series. He says, "I've seen damn little of God's justice in the world. Mine I know exists." The voice replies saying, "Then you have passed your own judgment." Corrigan is then told he will walk the earth as the focus for the wrath of the unavenged dead, cursed to confront evil and to understand it until he understands why people choose the dark paths they travel. He is also told it is a task he will ultimately fail. But Corrigan isn't listening. He is solely focused on the power he is now being given to return to the earth and carry out wrath and vengeance with almost no limitations. His unwavering focus on wrath and punishment caused his relationship with his fiancée to dissolve soon after he rescued her, and Jim Corrigan, as the Spectre, continued walking his haunted, immortal path in grim solitude for decades. But when Amy confronts this tendency, he turns his gaze of judgment on her, discovering guilt in her life, and yet guilt with complexity, not so easily judged. And so at Amy's insistence, and for the first time, Corrigan turns his judgment inward on himself, realizing that in his deepest core, he has been unable to forgive anyone for anything, in large part a reaction to the years of abuse he suffered at his father's hands. Jim Corrigan's admission of his own unwillingness to forgive ends the story on a quiet moment in which we sense that a significant change has taken place within him, and a new chapter in his life appears to have begun, one in which Amy might help him question some of the judgments he has taken for granted. Although there is a serial killer subplot threaded throughout these 4 issues that doesn't resolve until a few issues later, Crimes and Punishments is a story that can be enjoyed largely on its own. And not just as entertainment. As with the rest of the series, these opening 4 issues are filled with themes and moments that are very likely to trigger some worthwhile thought on issues of God, wrath, judgment, justice, guilt, evil, and more. There's just a lot going on in this series philosophically. If I look at this series with a glass half empty view, I can point out a lot of problems with the worldview affirmed by the writer. Despite pulling largely from Judeo-Christian theology, there are a lot of relativistic and legalistic ideas promoted through the voices of narratively sympathetic characters, or elements of the plot itself. Among the problematic ideas include the ability for everyone to find their own way to heaven, the high importance placed on forgiving oneself, on the basis that, we all have moral faults, and so, they don't worry about your moral faults so much, because since we all have them, apparently they're not faults or bad things after all. I don't know, it's really confusing when you analyze the logic there. The dead can be kept from heaven or hell if they are haunted by the nature of their own deaths. A person can be unworthy of heaven and yet not worthy of hell. Hell is the stereotypical demon-ruled torture chamber for humans, and other less overtly stated ideas. A common thread underlying all of these views? An absence of God and his absolute goodness and authority. Without God, there's no one left to judge us or determine forgiveness or punishment except the individual's subjective self-evaluation. Without God and his intended purpose for hell, its nature and purpose become conceptually warped and horribly misunderstood. Without God as the absolute standard of good and the being to whom we owe everything, the reasons for why people end up in heaven or hell become murky and inconsistent. So often, fiction that tries to portray elements of the spiritual world or life after death hangs on to the interesting or palatable, likable parts of Christian teaching for the average person, while dodging the most vital part, namely who God is and his purpose for creating. This series exemplifies what kind of philosophically inconsistent and logical mess results from that approach to supernatural storytelling. Having said all of that, when I look at this series as a glass half full. I'm pleasantly surprised at the elements of truth it affirms, such as the appropriateness of judgment after this life, the reality of sin in every human being, the complexity and failure involved when we try to pass judgment on each other, the existence, albeit always off-panel, of a creator God to whom we are in some way responsible, and even later in the series, an affirmation of key supernatural events in the Old Testament and the implied, but not quite stated, pivotal role that Jesus played in the forgiveness of sins for humanity through his death on the cross. With a willingness to apply a bit of your own headcanon interpretation to the series, there's a surprising amount that lines up with a Christian worldview. Perhaps a fairly liberal and certainly at times unbiblical worldview, but still a more Christian-inspired worldview than any other faith inspires it. Finally, I'll say that the writing is a bit dated, using unnatural-sounding expositional dialogue instead of the more modern use of, say, internal narrative boxes, things like that, and other storytelling devices. But the mood created by the visuals still holds up really well and helps the occasionally clunky dialogue to recede into the background for me. Whether you just want an introduction to the Spectre or are considering going on a hunt for all 62 issues of this series, the Spectre Crimes and Punishments is a great place to start. Although pretty expensive in physical format, you can get it for less than $10 right now on Kindle and Comixology. That's all for this installment of Essential Issues. Next time, we race onward to a major event story in the life of Wally West, the Flash, who inherited the mantle left by Barry Allen after he sacrificed himself to save the multiverse in Crisis on Infinite Earths. But what happens to Wally when his mentor returns from the dead? Believe it or not, it marks not the end, but a new beginning for Wally West as the Flash. So next time, we will take a look at the essential Flash story, The Return of Barry Allen. For my 7th consecutive year, I'm participating in Extra Life, a charity event that raises funds to provide medical care for children in urgent need. I'm also leading the Christian Geek Central Extra Life team, which you're still welcome to join by following the link in the description below. Once again this year, I'm drawing attention to our team's fundraising by performing a 24-hour marathon of video gaming that I will stream live on youtube.com/ChristianGeekCentral and ChristianGeekCentral.com beginning 5 a.m. Pacific Time on Saturday, November 7th. You can donate on my page or any team member's page by following the links below, where you will also find incentives and rewards for doing so. On my page, for example, for a donation of $5, you can choose a topic to add to my +3 page of many topics that I'll be blabbing my opinions on during the live stream. For $10, you get the previous reward and a download code for a free copy of the Spirit Blade Special Edition audio drama. For $20, you get the previous rewards and you can choose a game for me to play during my November 7th live stream. Pick a favorite or torture me with something terrible or rage-inducingly difficult. For $30, you get the previous rewards and you can choose a song for me to sing during my November 7th live stream. Pick an old favorite of yours or just make me humiliate and torture myself with something nobody wants to hear. And for $50 or more, you get the previous rewards and a download code for every MP3 product at spiritblade.com. That's an $80 value. On top of that, I have set fundraising milestones that will unlock strange and unusual happenings as I reach them. At $200, I'll have a free download day for everyone who visits spiritblade.com on November 11th. And as my total goes beyond $200, I'll unlock increasingly more content for the free download day. And depending how far beyond $200 my fundraising goes, during my November 7th live stream, I will show embarrassing clips of a movie I made in college with fellow Spirit Blade actor Michael Tully, put on a pair of Frozen socks and a Frozen t-shirt at the same time, shoot water up my nose with a turkey baster, and have my wife Holly play a video game with me for 30 minutes. And if I reach a personal fundraising total of $500 or more, I will face my greatest and most hated enemy in video gaming. I will finally beat Super Mario Bros. Without using cheat codes by the end of 2020, publishing video of my efforts and eventual success, and also make my first attempts during my Extra Life marathon. I freaking hate that game, but I will do this for those kids and their families, and for you sadistic people who donate money to make it happen. Now, there are some stipulations and time limits on those rewards and milestones, so quickly follow the link below to my fundraising page for all the details. I hope you will be a part of helping me and the Christian Geek Central team do some good for some kids and families who really need it. And then I hope you'll join me at youtube.com/ChristianGeekCentral for my 24-hour video gaming marathon starting 5 a.m. Pacific time on Saturday, November 7th. Hope to see you then.